sure what's going on. We'll see if I hit the laser button and for some reason it crashes things. Someone can explain that. That'd be amazing. We'll see how far we get here, otherwise I might have to ditch this. Anyway, so about the lab tonight, I think we're good there. And I'm sorry, there was a problem with the listserv and it didn't get sent as early as I thought it had. But you should now in your inbox have a message from me that includes the screening form that you need to fill out. And it also includes the assignment for the lab itself. There isn't really a lot in terms of preparation for the laboratory. The main thing is that you're there with the completed screening form, which you now have. And again, I don't need all your personal information, right? Just your name is sufficient, and then if you just go through the screening items. And again, if you have a screening concern or question, then just connect with me, and if that's not comfortable, we'll get you connected with someone else. I'll talk a little bit at the lab, maybe at the very end of class, but mostly it's a show up, work on the scanners for a while, collect some data, make some observations, and then I did send out an email too about a regrade opportunity. This is just a chance for some people that have not done as well as they wanted to on one or two of the assignments to resubmit it, even though the answers were posted, resubmit it with more carefully worked through solutions and make up at least half of the points or up to half of the points that they missed. If you're only missed a couple points on the assignments, it's probably not worth your time, and it's probably not worth our time to go through that process, but for some of you it could happen. So reach out to me. I have to make that opportunity available to everyone, but I'm hoping not everyone tries to do solutions for all the assignments, right? Okay, so just an announcement. This is where you're going to meet us. Some of you know exactly where to go inside the building, but don't do that. It's easier for me to bring you in as a group and make sure that everything's sort of set up and good to go. So if you're not sure where that is, reach out to your fellow students or connect with me after class. Okay, so the end of the last lecture, these were the learning objectives that we had, right? Be careful with that word for some reason. We wanted to hopefully understand how to combine data from several receiver channels. We didn't spend a lot of time on it, but it was basically just showing that you could have signals from independent channels and you could combine them through the root mean square process, but you would also normalize by the noise, so that if you had a really noisy channel, you wouldn't include it as much in the reconstruction process. And channels that had very low noise and high quality data, then you would sort of include them more so in the reconstruction process. And we went through, it was a little bit laborious, so it didn't do as much work. We didn't do any work on the board. We did it all through slides. But you should appreciate now how the final image that we get is obtained from the sum over all sampled spatial frequencies, or Fourier patterns. We worked through kind of in a somewhat rigorous fashion how it is that we have, how we obtain the image itself. We know how to get samples in K-space. How do we then go from those samples in K-space to forming an actual image? And the process there was this inversion process where we could finally write an expression that said the image is equal to, and it was the sum over all the different spatial frequency patterns and their weights, how present or absent was a particular spatial frequency. We talked a bit about how to define the field of view and the number of, and how the number of acquired data points impacts spatial resolution, and we'll see a little bit more of that today as well. And then we described some of the parameters that control the field of view. We'll have a gradient-specific lecture. I think it's the end of next week, and we'll get into a little bit more about how we sort of design the gradients to get specific fields of view, specific resolutions, phase encodings, all these kinds of things, and the limits that we hit when we try to do so. And then we talked a fair bit about using zero padding and why we need to use zero padding. What was the kind of main reason that we might use zero padding in MR image reconstruction? We're always using, so we're using FFT. So why was zero padding helpful?
Keep the ratio?
Yeah, it was mostly about keeping the ratio, right? So we can have asymmetric fields of view, we can have asymmetric resolutions, but all of our displays are square pixels, right? So if we want to properly display image information, one option is to zero pad, so we end up back with the right aspect ratio, a squished looking object. There are some other reasons. If your matrix size is 2 to the n, then you can use the sort of fastest Fourier transform implementation. So if you do a lot of image processing and a lot of image reconstruction and so forth, then you would want to use the fastest options for that. So and then we talked a fair bit about Gibbs ringing, and not just sources of Gibbs ringing, but also how to get rid of Gibbs ringing. So do you guys remember what Gibbs ringing sort of roughly arised from? It was basically two important things. What did you have to have in order to see Gibbs ringing? High resolution or low resolution? Low resolution. So lower resolution objects, you would see the Gibbs ringing would be much more apparent. So one solution, if you see Gibbs ringing, is just increase the resolution of your acquisition. That's not always straightforward, but that is a solution. We also talked about an image process. Oh, sorry. What was the other thing that you had to have? Not just low resolution, but
mismatch of the numbers of K1 and Ks.
a mismatch of. Say it again.
The number of lines is not the square number.
Only if that results in low resolution, I think, does that become a factor. There was something about the image intensities that mattered as well. If you wanted to see Gibbs ringing, you have to have a high contrast boundary, right? And that makes sense. If you have really low image intensity contrast across the image, the ringing is not going to be as apparent. And you can get as much as like a 10% overshoot, so that signal fluctuation can be about 9 to 10% with maximum contrast. So there's 0 in your background. What was the strategy? We talked about there were 2 strategies maybe to get rid of Gibbs ringing, right? One was increased resolution, which we already talked about. What was the other one that happened? Sorry, I heard a bunch of things. What's that? Hamming window. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't tell who was saying what. But yeah, we apply a Hamming window, right? So the Hamming window is a way of sort of filtering or weighting the acquired K-space data. It would substantially reduce the Gibbs ringing, but what was the penalty for using the Hamming window? Spatial resolution, right? So then we got a little blurring as a consequence of using that as well. So hopefully you've got some insight to those things. Some of the other things that we saw at least a couple times, one was that whether we sort of understood it from a signal acquisition strategy, which we'll talk about a little bit more today, or whether you just sort of remember it at this point, knowing that the field of view is equal to 1 over delta K. Again, not sort of in a lot of ways an intuitive observation, but certainly true. And what's the consequence of that? Well, if we increase our delta K, meaning we acquire only, say, half the lines of K-space, increasing delta K means field of view goes down. So now our field of view is smaller than what we had above. But the problem with a small field of view that's smaller than our object size, is it will incur aliasing. Specifically, aliasing in the phase encode direction. If you're a signals sampling kind of person, then you know about Nyquist criteria. In the readout direction here, we always oversample. It's kind of easy for us to do. And so we never have aliasing in the so-called readout direction, which means I can actually shrink my field of view left-right as much as I want, and I won't have aliasing of the signal across the field of view. But specifically, if I undersample in the phase encode direction, then the consequence is the smaller field of view and then the aliasing effect. The other thing we talked about was the full width half max, or the window width. Yeah?
Sorry, I just have a quick question. Could you repeat the second source of Gibbs ringing?
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 requirements for Gibbs ringing. One was low spatial resolution, and one was a high contrast boundary. So you have to have, and this is true of like picture imaging the head, where the background is basically zeros because it's just air, but then immediately subcutaneous, we typically have fat. Fat can be bright, so you have really bright signal next to dark zero signal. That high contrast will make the Gibbs ringing more apparent.
So the high contrast is the same thing as the high resolution, right?
No, so high resolution refers to the spatial dimensions.
Yeah, but essentially the resolution depends on how sharp the image is. So the high contrast may be related to the information we want to carry on the image is in high resolution, and we are trying to use a low resolution to represent that. That causes the ringing effect. Is it correct?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what you're stating. I think of those as independent effects. I can have a high resolution image. How do I want to say this? I can have a low resolution image, right? But if I don't have much contrast between adjacent objects, then I won't see Gibbs ringing. So I don't see Gibbs ringing just because it's low resolution. I need both of those things together. So then we spend a fair bit of time talking about the full width half max of the point spread function, or some measure of the width of the point spread function. And we learned that the Fourier pixel, the so-called Fourier pixel size, is characterized by the field of view divided by n. That shouldn't surprise us too much. We have a field of view of a certain number of millimeters or centimeters, and n is just the matrix size. So length divided by some dimension tells us the width of each individual pixel. More specifically for Fourier imaging, it's also related to 1 over n delta k, and you can see that relationship again between the field of view and 1 over delta k. And all of that was just to say that the Fourier acquisition strategy recovers for us the resolution that we maybe expect. It produces for us the resolution that we expect. Ready?
Is there any experiment or procedure to measure the point spread function?
Of a real system?
Yeah.
There are. I don't know if I could
I know,
explain it
for
right
example,
now.
in tomography, we can
Yeah.
measure the point spread function.
Yeah.
I have no idea about the system.
It's a great question, and I'd have to go back and think about how to specifically do that. So I'll say yes, there is a way, and no, I can't tell you right now. Sorry. Phil? Okay, let me know. Yeah. So then we looked at some other possible ways of reconstructing the data, which included the windowed reconstruction. Right? The windowed reconstruction was the Hamming window, right? And it doesn't surprise us that there should be some trade-off, right? The Hamming window was used to reduce Gibbs ringing, but then it had this blurring effect. And so the width of that point spread function was going to be greater than the Fourier pixel size. And it turns out for the Hamming window, it's not by very much. We maybe should have looked at some numbers. But it might be 10% probably in the point spread function or something like that. But it's not a doubling, right? It's not dramatically changing the spatial resolution. And so we also know now that if we acquire fewer high phase encode steps, then we get blurrier images. And if we add or increase and go further out into k-space, then we can recover a sharper image. The penalty, of course, of getting higher and higher resolution data will be the signal to noise that you might get in your image. So this was sort of just summarizing, I guess, that whole process that we talked about, where we have acquired Fourier data and we can do 2D-FT, discrete Fourier transform of the acquired K data to recover the underlying image, and that's what this inversion process was showing here, how we can invert from having the k-space data multiplied by all of the individual spatial frequencies, add all of that up to finally recover the image of the underlying object. And we added in here the potential for a window weight, so this is where that Hamming filter can come into play. And if we use the Hamming weight, then we're multiplying our k-space by some weighting function, and the consequence again is that although not apparent, we have some blurring of the overall image because the point spread function is a little broader, but importantly, we've really pushed down the Gibbs ring. So this is a very common reconstruction strategy. Okay, so I think that kind of wraps up where we were with the last lecture.
I have another question about the point spread function.
Yeah.
Our system is linear. MRI is
Linear, well, linear where?
because we define the point spread function,
Yeah.
we use the convolution.
Yeah.
I think those functions.
I mean, those are all linear functions. Those are all linear functions. So does the actual MR system perform? Does it actually perform linearly? No, right? There's different sort of imperfections in the system, or even nonlinearities like in the block equations themselves, right? So that's why I'm not sure exactly how to answer.
Even though it's error, you give it a point and you see what you get from just the transfer function.
You can. That's a little trickier than it sounds, though. And there are in fact other ways of doing it as well. Like, what's your point source? What's the object and dimension size of that point source? In principle, yeah, you could do that. But there are other ways. I can give you guys a much more solid answer, but I can't do it right now.
We just use these stuffs to find model of MRI.
So I'm not clear on what the maybe what the question
we
is.
just use the computer or something like that to just model that how
Yes, but the systems are also engineered, as sort of as precisely as possible so that they're in accordance with the mathematics as well, right? But the engineering of the systems, of course, can't be. The mathematics can be pretty perfect, right? We don't have to make that many approximations necessarily. But then it's a question of how well does the mathematics actually match the system that we're talking about. And that is a real problem in MR. So, for example, we oftentimes assume that when a gradient is turned on, it's linear over the extent of the volume that we care about. Right? You guys saw this as a homework problem, but it's not actually true. The systems can't be engineered to be perfectly linear. We cannot physically engineer a system where there won't be Maxwell fields. Right? If I generate one magnetic field, I will be generating cross fields as well. So there's certain things that we can't get away from, certain imperfections or laws of physics that we can't get away from. But we try to adapt to a mathematical framework that's linear and that hopefully simpler but still appropriate. Okay. So the big thing that we're going to talk about today is artifacts. So we'll work a little bit on the noise when we're talking about noise. You might want to come back to this lecture or perhaps some of the others for actually the second lab. So the second lab is really going to be focused on artifacts. The lab tonight is more focused on case space. So we'll take a little bit of time at the very end to talk about the lab, if we have time. So we've talked about and seen some artifacts already. We talked about aliasing, we talked about Gibbs ringing, and you've seen in your own homework as well as the lectures, noisy spike artifacts, right? So I want to talk about several other sort of sources of artifacts and then how we sort of deal with those artifacts. So I won't sort of go through the whole list, but this is the topics that I want to get to today. So let's think about noise for a little bit, right? Noise is an artifact, right? You would prefer to have images that had no noise, but at the end of the day, of course, we have noise. And there's some good questions as to what are the sources of noise. We can talk about that in just a second. What's shown here on the right-hand side is just an axial image through the head that was acquired, I don't remember how many times, 16 times or 32 times. And so you're just seeing the same image, not identically the same image, but the same subject having been imaged 16 times, and then we're just playing that as a movie. So you can obviously see the underlying noise in the image maybe more easily. We can talk about, say for... Okay, sorry for that. I'm going to do my best. Okay, so all I was trying to indicate here is that for any given pixel, we can talk about the intensity of that pixel, but the intensity of that pixel will be corrupted by noise. If we had lots of samples, 64 samples, then we would observe the individual fluctuations for that particular pixel. Some other pixel, of course, is going to have a lower signal, but it may have fundamentally the same sort of noise characteristics. So this is all we mean by sort of signals, mean signals, and then sort of the noise contribution that would appear on top of those signals. So the signal, there's different ways of measuring the signal to noise. I'll tell you about one of the simplest ways that we do it in MR. If you end up being an MR scientist, this is an okay way to look at signal to noise, but there are some flaws with this strategy as well. So if we want to estimate the signal to noise, it's some metric of image quality, right? We first need to estimate the signal, and we would take that maybe just as the mean signal intensity in some region of interest. So we have some region of interest that we care about. That assumes that the tissue in that region is homogeneous, and that may or may not be the case, right? You could have a mix of T1s or T2s, and so you would have some different signal intensities, but you're averaging it and calling it just one intensity. And it also assumes that noise is the only source of variance. So there could be other sources of variance besides noise. It could be things related to motion, other artifacts, like we said already, the tissue homogeneity, things like that. So we can estimate the mean signal intensity, nevertheless, in some region of interest, and then we can also make some estimate of the noise, which we take typically just to be the standard deviation of the background region of interest somewhere outside of the object. And so perhaps it's a region of interest here. And in this region of interest in particular, the assumption is that there's no other signal intensities there besides just noise, right? There's only noise-like fluctuations, meaning you don't have some artifact that's presenting and producing signal in there that would be like an aliasing artifact or some other flow artifact. We'll see some of these examples a little bit later. So again, we're assuming noise is the only source of variance in that sort of region of interest. it's an acceptable way of estimating the signal to noise, although there are, again, if you want to be a research scientist in this field, it's not the best way to measure the signal to noise. So we know how to measure the signal, we know how to measure the noise, we can calculate the signal to noise. You could also similarly calculate a contrast to noise ratio, so just taking the signal difference between two different regions of interest, white matter and gray matter, something like this, and still divided by the standard deviation of the noise. If you want to make experimentally, like what I think would be the best estimates of the signal to noise, you would go back and do the experiment that I showed you at the beginning, repeat the experiment, say 64 times, and if the only variability between all of those acquisitions is just noise, then you can get a pixel-wise map. You can calculate the mean of a pixel and the standard deviation of a pixel through time, and that would give you an even better estimate of the signal to noise. The downside, of course, is you would have to repeat your acquisition, right, 64 times or 32 times or something like this. Yeah.
Actually, I can have a question about the regional interest.
Huh?
Is there any standard size for regional interest?
No.
Okay. How we can define the SNR or CNR?
Well, I'm not sure you want more specific guidance, and I'm saying there is none.
If we select the deep regional interest,
Yeah.
our result.
It's unfortunately a subjective process, right? So if you pick a large field of, if you pick a large region of interest, you could pick this region of interest to be almost everything in the background, or use some mask to define these things. That might be okay, but in point of fact, there are other sources of variance in even the background. So you have to be very careful about these things, right? And I guess for that reason, there isn't really an acceptable standard to say, oh, the region should be this big or that small. And in point of fact, it's not even really the best way, it's certainly not the best way to measure the signal to noise, but it's the most widely used. But if you're going to use it in papers, if you're going to use this as your approach scientifically, most reviewers will flag this and say, there's other and better ways. So it depends really specifically on what you're trying to demonstrate or prove. If you're trying to prove something about the quality of your hardware, then you probably really need to do this in a very specific way. If you're imaging a patient under identical hardware setup, and you're saying this protocol compared to this protocol, you have a new T1 weighted method, and you have the old T1 weighted method, this might be a pretty okay way to do it, because things are kind of controlled. The coils are controlled, the system's controlled, the sources of noise are controlled. But if you're trying to use something much more technical, it can be flawed. Okay, so here's just an example of what happens between the image on the left. So the object on the left, the person's head, is constant, but the noise is changing dramatically. And the point here is just to say that the Fourier transform of noise is actually something very, very noisy, right? So if we think of noise as just being white noise, it's broad spectrum, lots of different frequency components. Then as the noise gets to be really intense, the K-space is also relatively uniformly intense. It sort of you require nearly all spatial frequencies to represent noise, right? And that'll be important in a second, because I think the next thing we're going to do is work on the portfolio. Okay. Okay, so we have the signals that we acquire, and the signals that we actually acquire I'll call S hat, and those are functions of K, what K point that we're actually acquiring, right? The distinction I'm making here with S hat is that it's equivalent to S of K plus this imperfection that we call noise. So I call this the data noise. This is from the Lauterbach book. He calls it, this is I guess it's C sub D, which is also, say, some function of the K-space point that you're acquiring. And for him, that's equation 840. In the imaging domain, so that's the K-space domain. In the imaging domain, we have a similar relationship that says the I of, say, X, right, is equal image of the underlying object itself plus some noise, which we call the image noise. So it's just that we know how to acquire this information, but the information that we acquire is in fact a combination of the information we want plus some noise. So rather this is what we actually end up measuring, right? And it's the true signal corrupted by noise. In this case, we're only specifically thinking about noise. So let's take the simple case of letting the underlying object itself or the image itself just be equal to 0, right? Which is to say, we just want to consider noise and noise only, right? So then, by Fourier reconstruction, we would have that the Cassis sub I, which varies over, say, M, and this here would be, this will be, say, like the pixel index. Pixel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is equal to 1 over n. And n, well, I'll define n in just a second. We're going to sum over n equals minus n over 2 to n over 2. This is the total number of points that we would acquire in k-space. Summing over the noise in the data domain, the data noise, if you will, which has an index over n. And this just ends up looking like the discrete Fourier transform. So it's e to the I 2 pi, should be m times n divided by big N. So this just goes back to the relationship that we had for inverting the k points that we would acquire, or it's related to the k points that we would acquire for the underlying image, but in this case we're only considering what happens to the noise itself, right? And then what n's do we actually care about here? This is for, say, should be minus n. Minus n over 2 less than or equal to m, less than or equal to n over 2. And this just goes back to, this is 8.42. So what's the point? We're just saying that there's a way of getting at, of relating the noise in the imaging domain to the noise in the data domain through something that looks like the discrete Fourier transform. And we saw this just a second ago, where if the image domain was purely noise and the k-space domain was also very, very close. This ED, or this C sub D, the noise itself, there's a few properties that are important. The noise itself is additive. In addition to additive, it's what we call ergodic. Ergodic means it doesn't, it's the same average over space and time. It means the statistics of the noise, if the statistics are ergodic, they're the same in time as they are over space for the system that we're considering. Why is that relevant? Well, a second ago I told you that you could draw an ROI in space to give you an estimate of the variance of the noise, right? So that means we can look at a signal that has a variance in space and assume that to be the same variance it would have in time, because we assume, and in fact it's a good assumption, that the noise itself is ergodic. We assume it's stationary. That means that the cause of noise, or even the source of noise, is not a dynamic thing that's somehow moving inside the object space. We also assume that it's uncorrelated, meaning it's not structured with something physiologic. It's not corresponding to something about some synchronizing timing in the system itself. It's just generally uncorrelated with itself. We assume it's also white noise. And white noise just means that it has a broad power spectrum density. the last things we assume is that it has zero mean. So that means whatever noise is being added to our signal doesn't actually change the, on average, amplitude of that signal or value of that signal. It has a zero mean signal. And we also assume that it's Gaussian in its distribution. So it's Gaussian and with a standard deviation that we just refer to as being sigma sub d. And we'll use the sigma sub d in just a second. So these are things we assume about the noise properties for this particular system. They don't strictly have to be true, but they are reasonable assumptions about the properties of noise for these imaging systems. If this is true for sigma sub d, C sub d, so we were indicating that these are all true for C sub d. It's just a linear transformation between the two spaces, and so it's also all true for the noise in the imaging domain. These are all these properties still hold, that they're additive, ergodic, stationary, etc. The one difference would be, just by nomenclature, we would say that it also has a standard deviation sigma sub I in the image domain. And those may not be the same sigmas because the actual amplitudes of these things can be different, but they can be defined. Now, it's not obvious, but from this expression, and Latimer works through this a little bit, from that expression we can actually work out that sigma sub I squared, so the variance of the noise squared, is equal to 1 over n times sigma d squared. And so that's coming from 8.44. And this is actually a really it was both in some sense an important discovery and an important expression for MR, because what it really says is that doing Fourier encoding is equivalent to endpoint averaging. What does that mean? Well, when we do the process of Fourier encoding, so think about acquiring data in the readout direction, we're going to acquire many data points, right? So here, this is the number of data points that we would be acquiring. The noise in the imaging domain, right, is 1 over n times the noise in the data domain squared. So that's actually not necessarily obvious, but it's really important because it means the more data points you acquire, it's equivalent to something like endpoint averaging. So it would be, you would have an exceptionally noisy image acquisition strategy if you tried, in fact, just to acquire individual K points sort of one at a time. But we don't do that. We end up doing these readouts to acquire echoes. Those echoes have many points acquired in them. And as a consequence, there's an averaging effect of noise through that acquisition strategy. And so that ends up being an important relationship for this class. It's easy, obviously, just to go from that to say that the noise in the imaging domain then is just 1 over the square root n times the noise in the data domain. And if we think of the number of points that we're acquiring, more points take more time, right? And so this is also going to be approximately equal to, or proportional rather, to the square root of time times sigma d. And so we'll see a relationship in a little bit that highlights this point, that says you need to, if you want to improve, say, if you want to decrease the variance of your image noise, right, you have to acquire a lot more points. So if I want my imaging noise to go down by a factor of 2, I have to get a lot more points, a factor of 4, and the number of points that I acquire is proportional to how long or the time it takes me to acquire data as well. And so it begins to make a connection between number of encoding points and the duration of the scan itself. Let me just clean up just here. Okay, so this tells us something about the actual noise for the system. Remember that the signals that we acquire, so if I just say the signal in the imaging domain, not the k-space domain, that's proportional. The amplitude of the signal I measure is something like 1 over n delta k. Why is that the case? Well, I'm going to have larger signals if I have larger fields of view and if I have fewer endpoints. Right? So the signal I get in the image domain itself, larger fields of view and a smaller number of points is going to give me larger signals. And the field of view connection comes in through the 1 over delta k relationship. So now we can talk about the signal to noise if we wanted to. Let's say the signal to noise is the signal that we get in the imaging domain divided by the variance that we get in the imaging domain. That's what we said sort of back when we were sort of just conceptually describing signal to noise. And so we know that's proportional to, say, 1 over n delta k times the square root of time over sigma d.
I think that's the standard deviation, not the variance. The variance should be the square.
This should be.
Just leave it as. I mean, he was confused because you said variance instead of standard deviation.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it should be the standard deviation divided by. It should be the mean of the signal divided by the standard deviation. If I said variance, I didn't mean variance.
Also, why this is the signal amplitude? What is the definition of the pixel size? The 1 over n.
Okay, so I shouldn't have said it. I shouldn't have said it definitionally, right? Right. So I was just making the claim, right, that the magnitude of signal coming from a pixel basically depends on the pixel size, right? Field of view divided by n tells me about pixel size. Big pixels, lots of signal. Small pixels, less signal. So what does this actually work out to? Well, the same expression here. Sorry, the blue pen is sort of going on us here. This just looks like field of view divided by n, right? Times something like the square root of time. And so this is useful, right? Because everything in here is a parameter that we control. Right? We can control the field of view, we can control the number of points, and we can control how long we scan for. What you notice, unfortunately, is sort of how these things trade off, right? So, and we'll look at some examples in just a second, but if I want to double my signal to noise, for example, right? If I want to double my signal to noise, what do I have to do to my time? It has to go by a factor of 4, right? So this is a problem in MR, right? We may want substantially better signal to noise, but we have this root time penalty, right? Which means it's difficult to substantially improve your signal to noise quickly, right? So there's a real penalty there, so to speak. And what this really boils down to, so this is really sort of thinking of it maybe in the one-dimensional sense. I could have written this as field of view in the x direction and the number of points in the x direction. We could write this more generally as just being equal to what we call the voxel volume, V, and the square root of scan time, T. So this here is just, sorry, the pen's dying. This is just the voxel volume. Voxel is just a 3-dimensional pixel, right? We can control the voxel volume by our imaging parameters that we choose. And we have some control over the scan time itself. There are other things that affect the signal to noise, right? These just happen to be some of the simplest things that we control when we're on the scanner. What else controls, for example, the signal intensity that we get in a pixel? What makes a pixel bright or dark?
Well, whenever we get the
Sequence.
whenever we get the exactly.
Sorry, I couldn't.
Well, whenever we decide like, oh, get to see, get the signal right here, whenever.
Yep.
They're not like
Yep. And then Jauhan, you said it with a different word.
Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, the signal you get depends on what sequence you image the
Yep.
object, right?
No, exactly. You guys are both onto the same thing, right? It depends on what have you done to the prepared magnetization in the first place, right? Is it T1 weighted? Is it T2 weighted? Is there inversion pulls? So there's all these other things that also matter. But when you go to sit down at an MR scanner, you don't know those things, right? You don't know what the T1 was. You don't know what the T2 is. That, in fact, might be the goal of the experiment that you're actually working on, right? So all we're saying here is that the signal to noise is proportional to things like voxel volume and the square root of scan time, right? You could add proton density in here, for example, right? That'd be an easier sort of linear term to add in front. So there's lots of other sort of possibilities. What the scanner, you'll see this, well, you'll see it tonight if you look carefully. It'll be a little bit more of a focus in the second lab. But the scanner itself actually uses this really basic relationship to tell you about what they call the relative signal to noise for images that you're acquiring. So when you lay out a protocol in the scanner and you're about to run it, it'll say the relative signal to noise of your sequence is 1. It's just relative, so it says it's 1. And now you go and do something like decrease the slice thickness by half. Okay? What's that going to do to my signal to noise? Cut it in half, right? So the scanner will say, well, that's an easy calculation. We'll just tell you the relative signal to noise is down by a factor of half. The reason, now that calculation seems almost trivial, but when you're working on the fly and changing several parameters at a time, looking quickly at that relative signal to noise number will tell you whether the protocol you've just cooked up is, how much worse is it than what you started with, or in fact, how much better might it be than what you started with. So you can look at that tonight when you're on the scanners, but you might, and that'll become more relevant when we work on the actual second lab. Okay, so questions about sort of what I worked through here? We'll talk through this a little bit more and make some examples as well. Okay, so this is the sort of final expression that we ended up there, right? So needless to say, larger voxels, but that's not a good thing, right? Larger voxels mean low resolution. That's going to give us high signal to noise. And long scan times are also going to give us high signal to noise. Consequently, high resolution imaging that's also fast really compromises our potential signal to noise, right? Everyone wants things that are high resolution, and everyone wants images to be acquired quickly, but that's not good for signal to noise, which is one metric of overall image quality. So what actually compromises the voxel volume? Several things, right? First thing is the slice thickness. We can choose in MR to have a 3 millimeter or 10 millimeter slice. And then in addition to that, it's what's happening in plane, right? What's your X resolution, what's your Y resolution? And we can independently control all 4 of those parameters, right? When we sit down on the scanner, we can choose our field of view in say the left-right direction. I can choose the field of view in the AP direction or superior-inferior direction. And I can also choose my matrix size. Obviously, I can only choose 2 out of these 3 and 2 out of these 3 because they're linked through a simple equation there. The other one I can change when I'm working on the scanner is the data acquisition time, right? I can control, again, the number of points that I want to acquire, both, say, in the KX and the KY direction. And I can also change what I call the number of averages. I could simply repeat the entire experiment, right? That would double my scan time, double my acquisition time. And it would increase how much would I increase my signal to noise if I double my scan time? Just square root of 2, right? A parameter we haven't talked very much about is the bandwidth. The bandwidth is related to how fast you acquire your data. So if you have high bandwidth, you're acquiring your data very quickly. It means you're moving through K-space very quickly. And if you move through K-space very quickly, you don't benefit from that same sort of noise averaging effect. I'll spend a couple slides, a little bit of time talking specifically about bandwidth. You'll see it as a parameter on the scanner tonight. You should look for it. And it'll be an important parameter when you do the second. So there's a slightly more complicated version of the same expression, right? It just says these terms that lead the front here just tell you about voxel volume, right? It's the field of view along X divided by the number of points you acquired, same along Y, and then the slice thickness. If you take into consideration the scan time parameters, then you have the number of points you're acquiring in KX and KY and the number of averages. If you're doing three-dimensional imaging, which we've said is also possible, you can also have an NKZ parameter in here, and then divided by the underlying bandwidth. You'll obviously see that NKX, for example, shows up in two places. So when you're making these changes on the scanner, you have to think all the way through. Changing the number of points you acquire changes your resolution, but it also changes your scan time, right? So it's not just the square root factor, it's not just the voxel volume factor. You can work that out to simpler terms if you want to. Okay, so we've already talked about some of these, but one example is if we have our slice thickness, right? That means we have to get 4 times as many averages if we want to maintain the signal to noise. So you should, if you get into the sort of science of doing MR, you're constantly making these kinds of calculations in your head as you change and manipulate parameters, or you're looking at that relative signal to noise monitor on the scanner. Another possibility, right? So we could double our slice thickness. So we go from a 4mm slice to an 8mm slice. That will increase our signal to noise by what factor? 2, right? But if we want to maintain our signal to noise, then in principle we could cut down on our total scan time by a factor of 4, or reduce it by 25%. How you go about actually reducing scan time is in part sort of still a challenge in MR. It's an interesting research topic, which mostly regards how can you undersample, how can you acquire, specifically in which fewer K points, but still reconstruct an acceptable image. There's some lower limits based on information theory and other things. Another possibility, so your field of view, in general it's fixed, right? You pick your field of view to match your underlying object size. You could increase the resolution, you could increase NKX, or you could increase NKY. This results in an increase in scan time, right? If you're going to increase NKX and NKY, these two are going to go up. But you've also done it to increase your resolution, so you've decreased your voxel volume size there. So you have to take into consideration sort of both the voxel volume effect and the scan time effect when you change your pixel size. In a couple lectures, not the next lecture, but one of the first guest lectures, we'll talk a lot more about parallel imaging. And I suggested just a second ago that there are ways to actually acquire far fewer K points, so-called undersampling strategies. The one example we've seen already, when you undersample your data, it can result in aliasing, right? You see this fold-over artifact if we only get half of our K lines. There are some really pretty sophisticated ways, though, of still reconstructing the imaging information without aliasing artifacts when you have, in fact, undersampled the number of K points that you acquire. Most of those strategies, at least one category of acquisition strategy in that regard, is called parallel imaging. And in parallel imaging, you have the conventional signal to noise, but then you have 2 penalties here. The first one is the rate penalty. And it just means if I scan twice as fast, then I obviously have to decrease my signal to noise. I wouldn't expect to get equivalent, and obviously I must get lower signal to noise. So the rate factor here is just related to that square root of time penalty. There's also something called the G factor, and the G factor is more related. It's not important right now. We'll actually revisit it in the parallel imaging lecture. But it's related to how well you can perform the image reconstruction task, and it's based in part to the quality of the coils that you're using and the actual encoding strategy that you use. The point here really is that the SNR for parallel imaging kind of has 2 hits from it. Something about the reconstruction acquisition strategy, and then of course the fact that you've acquired less data so that you would be scanning faster. So those G factors, there's different values for those. If you're rate 1, then there's no G factors. You get up to rate 2, then it gets up to, say, 10 or 50%, and it's even worse with higher and higher acceleration factors. The one thing I really wanted to show you from this is that in parallel imaging, you have this interesting problem where the SNR can be spatially dependent. So everything I was showing you previously was just sort of noise fluctuating uniformly all over the field of view, and it looks kind of even. Unfortunately, with parallel imaging, you'll get spatially dependent noise. So you can see that in these examples here. This would be just sort of conventional cardiac imaging with no, acceleration, no underlying acceleration strategy. You can increase to rate 2 acceleration. Rate 2 acceleration, it's a funny nomenclature. Rate 2 doesn't actually mean rate 2. Don't ask. You would expect the acquisition time to go down by half, right? But it doesn't quite. They want it to be rate 2, right? So they call it rate 2. Anyway, you can go to higher and higher acceleration rates. And what you see at some extreme, right, some so-called rate 4 acceleration, you've cut your acquisition time maybe by a factor of 3 in this case. But the noise looks really strange, right? You'll have these noise patterns that are really noisy in some areas and then maybe no noise in other areas, and then really noisy in some areas and really not noisy in other areas. What's the question?
I mean, no, it's weird. No in some areas, no in other areas.
Right, and I'm not giving you an in-depth sort of perspective or view here on what the underlying sort of strategy is here, but it's related to the coil sensitivity profiles that we've seen before. And so coils they pick up lots of signal in some areas, but they don't pick up signal further away from them. And I mentioned it, but those coils themselves are doing spatial encoding, right? They're sensitive to some regions in space and less sensitive to other regions in space. And there's a way of using those sensitivity profiles to help you with this aliasing problem. But you will end up with these really uneven patterns of signal to noise. And then if you go back and use the signal to noise strategy that we were showing you earlier, where you draw a region of interest and then you get draw two regions of interest and get averages, it really won't be an acceptable way of characterizing the noise in this kind of acquisition and reconstruction strategy. Yep.
8 seconds just for one cardiac cycle or just for one, right?
8 seconds for 20 cardiac frames, something like that. Yeah. So I showed you a few slides going back a ways about segmented case-based imaging. And so if we want to acquire these kinds of images, we synchronize the MR system to your heart rate, and then we get part of case-space in one heartbeat, another part of case-space in another heartbeat, and we call those segments. And so we can very easily get really nice quality images in 8 or 9 seconds, 10 seconds, something like that.
Single breath hold.
I can hold my breath that long.
Yeah.
Longer. But it raises a good question, right? So why, what's the point of going down to 3 seconds? Does this really matter? Well, for some patients really cannot hold their breath well, right? And in some patients, the strategies, I could go on and on about what the different strategies are here, but faster scanning up to a limit can be better, right? You would argue that this image quality here is still diagnostic. You can still use it for an imaging task. Even at rate 3, it's mostly diagnostic, but these things kind of crash, they kind of fall off at some point. And the limits of parallel imaging right now are somewhere between sort of rate 2 and rate 3 for 2-dimensional imaging, and then if you go to 3-dimensional imaging, you're encoding the whole head or whatever, then you can start pushing rates of like 4, 5, 6. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves. We're going to have a whole lecture on parallel imaging. Really, it's exciting technology, but it's also kind of, it was, kind of first conceptualized like 97, and 10 years later it was pretty solved, right? So I don't think there's a lot of really good imaging problems in parallel imaging reconstruction, and now there's this whole field of compressed sensing, and that's been the last, well, not quite 10 years. And that's a nonlinear problem, so it's going to take 100 years before people solve that one completely. Okay. I mentioned it before, but we haven't really gone into too much detail about it, but you saw it in the signal to noise expression that there's this parameter called bandwidth. It's something we can control on the scanner. If you've taken signals in systems before, then you're maybe used to thinking of receiver bandwidths and acquisition bandwidths and so forth. Different definitions, but the receiver bandwidth for us is the range of frequencies across the field of view, right? And so you could measure it potentially in something like plus minus kilohertz. It depends a little bit on which manufacturer you're using, so you have to pay careful attention. If it's not the range of frequencies across the whole field of view, then it's the range of frequencies across just a single pixel. And we would call this usually the pixel bandwidth. So the sort of conventional bandwidth is just purely in frequency, but the pixel bandwidth is going to be in hertz per pixel. In fact, the scanners that you guys will use here at UCLA will all be in terms of hertz per pixel. And here we're referring to what's happening during the readout part of the acquisition. So we turn on a readout gradient. That readout gradient can be designed in different ways, and in fact can have different bandwidths associated with it. So what are we talking about? Well, when I turn on a gradient, right, what happens, I can turn it, here I'm showing 2 different gradients, right, a kind of shallow gradient and then a steeper gradient. So let's just think about the steep gradient. When I turn on a steep gradient, that means I've generated a magnetic field gradient across my field of view. So at the middle of my object, it's here I'm using frequency specifically, not angular frequency. So usually we talk about omega 0, here I'm just talking about f0. And at the right and say left edges of the field of view, then I'll have higher frequencies because of the presence of the gradient. And on the left-hand side, you know that the field is going to oppose the B0 field, and the overall magnetic field is lower there, and hence the precessional frequency is lower there. So we can define the range of frequencies across the field of view as depending on the applied gradient strength and the field of view that we're interested in, whatever that is for, say, the experiment that we care about. And then, of course, some things that we don't control, things like gammas and 2-pods, right? Needless to say, you can pick any two of these three, right? We have three possible parameters to choose from. When it comes to designing a protocol, sitting down and working on the scanner, the ones we always work with are the field of view, because of course that is governed by the object that we're trying to image. And the other one that we can freely select is something about the bandwidth, either the full bandwidth or the pixel bandwidth. And that means that there's a design parameter that's free, and that's the gradient strength. And so the gradient strength is chosen based on you as a user selecting your bandwidth and the field of view for the object that you care about. And then, of course, there's limits, right? Our G, for example, can only go up so high. We have maximum gradient strength. So we'll talk more about that in the gradient design lecture. When we think in terms of sampling temporal signals, we have the Nyquist sampling requires that the delta t, the sampling time, has to be 1 over twice the range of frequencies that you actually care about. The similar requirement for k-space, the so-called k-space Nyquist sampling, that requires that the delta kx, or the step size in k space, is related to the gradient strength that we apply and the delta time, the time that you take to acquire a single point in k space is the way to think about that. And so again, in this expression here, we control the delta kx, because that's related to our field of view. And we choose the delta t, because I'll show you in a second, that's related to the bandwidth. And then the gradient itself is what's left as sort of the design parameter. It's constrained by that expression there. So we know what delta kx is related to the field of view. We also know that the number of points we acquire times the times the delta kx, the delta spatial frequency, that's just related to nx over the field of view, and that itself defines the spatial resolution. The number of points divided by the field of view tells us what is our spatial resolution. So we can, in fact, change the magnitude of this gradient, right? We could choose different magnitudes to use for this, but that'll be changing either the field of view or the acquisition bandwidth. Usually the gradient amplitude itself is calculated. So you can choose different receiver bandwidths. You could choose a low receiver bandwidth. You could choose a high receiver bandwidth. If you choose a high receiver bandwidth, it necessarily means you're going to need stronger gradients. And so at some point, you'll hit a maximum possible receiver bandwidth that you can use. A high receiver bandwidth means that there's a large range of frequencies across the field of view, or in fact, across an individual pixel. So that means that there could be less chemical shift. Remember that fat resonates at a slightly different frequency. It's down frequency from water. And if you have a wide, but it's down frequency in percentage terms, right? And so if we have a large range of frequencies across the field of view, the chemical shift effect will be more exaggerated than if you have it'll be less exaggerated than if you have a low bandwidth across the field of view. So high receiver bandwidth, you'll have less chemical shift. That's a good thing. I'll show you some examples in a second. But you'll consequently also have lower signal to noise. And that's primarily because you have shorter acquisition times. If your receiver bandwidth is high, then you're moving through k-space quickly. Your delta t is short, and you're getting the same number of points. So you're going to zip through k-space quickly, and you don't have the same sort of noise averaging effect. A sort of secondary effect here is that with high receiver bandwidths, because your readout gradient is going to be shorter in duration, then your echo time is also going to be shorter. So that might actually help you, right? Shorter echo times generally give us a little bit more in terms of signal to noise. This is a parameter that you, again, should kind of notice tonight, just when you're taking good notes of what sequences you ran to do your experiments tonight. It'll be an important parameter when you get to this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this chemical shift effect. We've seen it in some different regards. What we're really going to do now, let's see, where are we going to let's just No, let's go ahead and it's a little after 3. Let's take a few minute break, and then I'll come back and talk about probably 5 or 6 different artifacts.
是可选的呀，就是人为反射。我觉得还是因为，我觉得是一个规律强的嘛，规律越强，那个越快。
他当时说你那个第二天做完没有关系，
哦，他是说你可以 disable 你的 TDS，是这样，
应该是这个
可以 enable 可以让你设的很短，
说让你增加这个极限。
这样子可以。TD 本来是人为 TD 但是原来
I don't remember if they had all the options.
到不了那我增加一个最小的时候。
还有旁边为什么？你可以分就是 T， 就是没有的。也可以有一个无穷大的 case day， 你可以是被决定是 n， 那你就说你是 n 级 FT。如果你可以变2n， 没人拦着你。information 是3个分解相关的，然后在等于你回了一个 n 的 image， 然后你 stretch， 没人拦着你，可以改。是啊。很了解的。你 carry 了这么多的2 just go there。可以把那个2的 information 啊，把那个linear blur一下，没有可能。
有点好的。
你混淆了你的图片大就是跟你的 space， 里面是 space， 你在空间上面一个然后你 ROI 只有那么大，就是我一年是容没那么大，你要表现就是这么大，
就是看它只是因为色彩样造成的，不是
手，你说到手这里，图上你踩完样了，你现在是一个踩完样的过程，你如果产品信号记录，然后它就是无穷大，是没有办法再用一张图片去用这个那个手，你不能用手去表示一个模拟信号了，根本就没意思。
Oh, okay, cool.
手机写sample 完一 sample 来。
That's funny.
我管你在哪里踩，
But I don't understand that.
我管你在 face 还要 image， 只要是采样的就
then you will be happy there.
它的分辨率，
Yeah.
光合有机什么？
Because someone is asking me. Always.
But it's different.
Yeah, I know. How do you do that? I know. Yeah.
And I just want to make sure there's anything. Something that's like,
Yeah,
if you
it
have
takes
something
forever.
good,
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree.
I should ask him each picture should take $10.
You should charge that.
Why is it not about energy?
I think they also need to.
Yeah, this also.
Yeah, you need
Energy
maybe
what,
they're
for
just
what?
thinking
The signal and the noise.
Well, yeah, okay, but what is energy? Like what joules? Like what do you want?
Yeah.
Here, just
Signal
pixel
has
intensity.
square.
Yeah.
The square of the from the
Uh,
Wikipedia definition.
You
of
might
it.
say, yeah, you have to be very careful about what sort of system we're talking about, though, right? We're talking about SNR for imaging system or SNR for some other system.
There are several
So
definitions.
there are several definitions. I'm just giving you at least maybe the simplest one. I'm not saying it's
It's
the
like while we are doing the homework,
I couldn't.
when we are doing
Only to a definition.
Yeah, well, just ask though, right? Ask me, ask the TAs. There's always like 3 or 4 people at office hours, right? So if you're not sure, I'm not trying to be confusing.
I'll let you
Just
know
ask.
what's the finish.
I should start, otherwise we'd run out of time. Alright guys, I know it's easy to sink into just hanging out with your friends. But we gotta talk about chemical shift and some other things. Okay, so this, we've probably seen this a couple different ways, a couple different times, right? Ideally, gradients just provide us with a linear variation in frequency across, the field of view that we care about. But we already know that fat has this 3.5 parts per million lower frequency. So fat behaves a little bit differently than water. Other things can be chemically shifted as well, but fat is kind of the most obvious one that we encounter. But the scanner detects frequency, right? And we map frequencies to positions. So if something isn't behaving like we expect, if it's not behaving like water, then we can misappropriate its location because we're only measuring frequencies. The frequencies are supposed to tell us about positions. And now we have this problem that fat doesn't want to process at the frequency of water, and so it does something differently. The scanner simply assumes everything is water, right? What better assumption is there? So unfortunately, fat, which is going to be at a lower frequency, is going to be interpreted as a lower frequency, it's going to be interpreted rather as lower frequency water, right? Because we sort of treat everything as being water. And so the ideal sort of gradient, if you will, is the blue gradients, right? This is how water would behave. But fat itself is going to be offset from that because it has this parts per million frequency offset. So what does that mean? Well, for a given frequency that we would be interpreting to accord with a particular position, if it's water, it's this position. We're also getting frequency information from fat, which is at another position. But it all gets encoded into that same frequency bin, if you will. And so fat at that position and water at that position just look to be the same thing, just giving signal amplitude to a specific and narrow range of frequencies. And so that's a problem, chemical shift artifact, right? And so, so this builds up a little bit here. So across the bottom here, this is the bandwidth that we were just talking about. We can pick the imaging bandwidth on the scanner, and we can use low bandwidths, or intermediate bandwidths, or high bandwidths. These are the bandwidths in terms of the hertz or kilohertz measured across the entire field of view, and it accords with, say, the readout direction, the left-right readout direction. You don't see the signal-to-noise differences very well in this image, but you see the chemical shift effects. So low bandwidth, so in this case, this would be a reasonably low bandwidth for MR acquisitions. You can see this white ring of subcutaneous fat is sort of shifted to the left, right? And if you look at it, say on the far right-hand side, then that same sort of bright ring of subcutaneous fat is represented in its geometrically sort of correct position. If the bandwidth is high enough, then the chemical shift will be, sub-pixel, right? If the bandwidth is really low, the chemical shift could be several pixels. So controlling the bandwidth is important if chemical shift artifact is a specific problem. So what are the solutions? We've sort of seen this or talked about this already. We can use high bandwidth, but that's going to hurt your signal to noise some. It ultimately reduces the acquisition time. That's why you have a noise penalty. But it will reduce that chemical shift artifact. And if the chemical shift artifact sort of can't be dealt with by things like dealing with bandwidth, then there are ways of actually saturating the fat itself. If we have time today, we'll get into some strategies for getting rid of fat signals or separating out fat signals, which are pretty interesting. A broader category of artifacts, and one that's really common in MR, is motion artifacts. One of the main reasons that we have motion artifacts in MR is the fact that MR acquisition strategies are typically slow. Right? It takes seconds to acquire images in general. And if it takes seconds to acquire images, well, there's lots of physiologic things that can happen in a second. Right? So motion is principally responsible for corruption in spatial localization along the phase encoding direction. You have to remember that when we acquire an echo in the left-right direction, that just takes milliseconds. So if there's motion during milliseconds, that probably doesn't have much of an effect on our image quality. But in the phase encode dimension, those echoes are acquired milliseconds apart, and it could be a second or more from the bottom of, according to me, from the bottom of K-space to say the top of K-space. And that'll give you blurring and even ghosting artifacts. So what kinds of motion can we have? Lots, right? Patients themselves move, they get restless, they don't want to be in the scanner, they're done, they want to go home. There's obviously breathing motion, which you can suspend for some period of time, right? Most people can hold their breath comfortably for 10 or 15 seconds. I've gotten just over 2 minutes before, so we can have a little contest if you guys want to. And then there's cardiac motion, and cardiac motion, of course, leads to other things like vascular pulsations and venous flows and all kinds of other things. And in fact, we're looking at a technique right now where cardiac motion pushes on the liver, right? Your heart sits here, just above the diaphragm, which is adjacent to the liver, and the cardiac pulsatility onto the liver causes artifacts of liver imaging, and we're dealing with ways of reducing those artifacts, for example. These first ones, you can do something to, you can kind of control it, or in some sense kind of control it. There's other things that we can't, right? There's peristalsis and sort of bowel and gas motion and things like that, that if you're doing abdominal or pelvic imaging in particular, there's involuntary motions that you can't even predict and you can't control, and there's oftentimes very little to be done about it. Some of these, though, we have some strategies for, right? I think there's a slide that talks about strategies, but I'll skip it when we get to it. When it comes to patient motion, coaching is an important thing, right? We can tell patients to sort of make sure they understand you really need to hold still for the next 3 minutes because these are really important images that we're going to get, and then we'll give you a break and you can, while we set up the next thing, you can just kind of relax for a bit. Respiration's pretty easy to control in different ways. We can ask people to hold their breaths. We can also synchronize imaging to the respiratory cycle. And the same with cardiac motion. Obviously totally involuntary, but through using an ECG, we can synchronize the MR imaging system to your specific ECG and synchronize imaging to your heart rate or rhythm. And then these last ones, of course, are much harder to control. So lots of different possible motions, and some of these motions can be quite slow. So the picture you can have in mind is you have some object, and the object is drifting during the acquisition cycle, right? So it's going to take me seconds to get my images, and the object is somehow moving through the field of view during the acquisition strategy. So where this object is moving while I'm recording K-space, right? So I'm just going to do what we call single-shot imaging. I'm going to acquire the top of K-space down to the bottom. But unfortunately, my object is moving during that acquisition strategy. And importantly, it's moving in the up-down, or what we think of as the phase encode direction. And so the resultant image of that object, because it's moving, when I acquire a K-space, say top-down, I'll end up with images that look like this. And this is sort of a typical motion-blurred image. And you might sort of ask yourself, well, why are those the kind of artifacts that I see? And one way to think about understanding it is to actually look at what's happening in K-space as you make the acquisition. And so when I acquire, say, the top part of K-space, it'd be helpful if we could drop the lights. I don't put you to sleep, but we'll do it for a little bit. So let's say the object is at the bottom when I'm acquiring this top part of K-space. Well, the Fourier transform of that part of K-space gives me a faint sort of silhouette of an object, high-frequency information silhouette that's on the right-hand side. And now the object has moved, say, up in the field of view, and I get the next block of K-space. Well, Well, that block of K-space actually accords with this kind of silhouette of the object that I've acquired. And then I finally get to the middle of K-space. In the middle of K-space, the object is maybe in the middle of the field of view, but the K-space data that I get is kind of low resolution. Now it's got some Gibbs ringing associated with it, and it's a little bit blurry because it's low resolution information. And then we're just continuing through, right? The object has moved to a different position when I get the next block of K-space and then the last block of K-space. But the composite image that you form is from all of these different acquisitions, right? Each of these acquisitions just represents a different block of K-space. And so if you actually do the 2D Fourier transform of the acquired data, then you're going to end up getting something. Yep.
How do you distinguish Gibbs?
So Gibbs ringing will really only be apparent like inside the object, and it'll be really like concentric with the object. The motion artifacts themselves, you'll typically, this is a very typical sort of pattern, right? Meaning that you see this sort of, it looks a little bit like Gibbs ringing, but you have this sort of blurring and sort of replication of sharp features, throughout the entire field of view. Gibbs ringing is pretty constrained, a few cycles sort of near the object. Here you see these sort of, almost banding, sort of striking artifacts kind of across the whole field of view. But precisely what you'll see will entirely depend on, how did you acquire K-space relative to the underlying motion? Was it a lot of motion, a little bit of motion? When did the motion occur? If the motion all occurred just here, and then they were, holding their breath for the rest of K-space, the artifacts would be less apparent. Yep.
Shifting space means adding phase in frequency.
It does, yeah.
Magnitude of K-space,
Correct.
why the K-space change? I agree that if we look at the phase of the K-space,
Yeah.
it's definitely different.
But why?
Yeah.
I mean, it's related to. I mean, there is actually a nice sort of derivation of this in the book that I'm actually not going through, where you see what happens to spins that move through a gradient field. And if spins are moving through a gradient field, they'll accumulate phase as a consequence of that motion. Not in addition to the phase that's supposed to be there from the applied gradients for imaging code. So there's two sources of phase on the signal. There's a motion component of spins moving through a gradient. And then there's another component, which is the encoded phase for image formation. So here's just another example, sort of an in vivo example, right? So this is what the abdominal image, right? So orienting you, chest wall in the front, this is the back, spine in the middle, and then it's mostly you're seeing the liver in cross-section, axial view. And this is, an example image of what we could get with a breath hold. On the left-hand side, so maybe it takes, 20 seconds to acquire this image. If the patient doesn't hold their breath at all, then you'll get images like this, right? So if we don't do something to control respiration, we can have really catastrophic images. On the left-hand side here, we've actually switched the phase encode direction. So these kinds of artifacts are phase encoding artifacts. You won't see them in the readout direction because it's so fast, right? The phase encode direction is acquired relatively slowly, and so all of that motion is sort of spread out across the different points in K-space that are required. But if we change the phase encode direction from being up-down to being left-right, then we can still get some motion artifacts associated with breathing, and now they're apparent in the left-right direction rather than the AP direction. So if I showed you images like this, you would be able to quickly identify what's the phase encode direction. Right? That's something that would be a reasonable expectation. You will. I try to point these things out. You will almost certainly have an artifacts question on the final. So I actually talked about some of these already. So what are the possible solutions, right? Breath holding. There's another strategy called respiratory gating. So we can put a bellows, a monitor around your abdomen, and we can monitor your breathing pattern and try to synchronize the imaging to your breathing pattern. So when you're at end expiration, we can do some imaging, and then when you breathe, we stop imaging. When you exhale, we image again. It's not always perfect, but it's a possible strategy. And then anything you could do to, you would get similar motion artifacts if the person was just restless and moving around in the scanner, right? So possibly reducing body movements through coaching. Sometimes there's, it sounds a little overwrought, right? Physical restraint, but there are padding and straps and things we can do to sort of hold people comfortably, trust me, comfortably in place. Under extreme conditions, though, you have so-called uncooperative patients, right? That can be lots of reasons that someone can be uncooperative. It has something to do with their mental state at that point in time. And there are methods whereby we can sedate people if necessary. The extreme being actually full anesthesia for pediatric cases, for example. Yep.
And other solutions that you could apply post-collection?
There are. That's such a great question. Yeah. It's not easy, and it depends on sort of the source of the problem. But if you really understand sort of the physiology and how the physiology affects signals, there are some ways of correcting your acquired data, which are not, they're not easy. They're not robust, I would say. But people are working on those kinds of strategies for sure. So what are the disadvantages of those kinds of solutions? Well, breath holding means you have to be able to image quickly, right? Respiratory gating means you're probably going to increase the scan time, and it may have some impact on the TRs that you can use, especially for long TR sequences. And then reducing body movements, well, it's a question of sort of patient acceptance and comfort and so forth, right? You can only do so much to like slow them down. I can remember when I was in grad school, there's a lot of like neuroimaging. They want to do really high resolution imaging in the head. And high resolution imaging in the head might be, a couple hundred microns or something like that. And so you could volunteer for these experiments, right? And they would put you in the scanner and then put you in a head coil. And the head coil, the top of it comes off when you lay down inside it, and they snap the head coil off over you. So if you're claustrophobic, just being in a tube, and even more claustrophobic, having this like cage around your face. And then they really wanted you to hold still, so they actually made a cast of your teeth. And you had to bite down on this like contraption so you could hold your head in place the whole time, right? Hold still while we image you, right? But it was enough to pay for my Metro card to get to work. So it was okay. But you have to always be conscientious of acceptance and comfort, right? So here's a different kind of motion artifact, right? So we see this as an example of like aortic pulsation or arterial pulsation, or you could even have it for some other reason, swallowing or something like this, right? But the basic idea is that there's a large part of your field of view is relatively static. It's just conventional sort of tissues or whatever. But then there's some area that's pulsating. Now, why does the signal intensity itself pulsate? That's a trickier question. It has to do with the fact that, say, if you think about my abdominal aorta, it's a high flow rate vessel, and there's new spins coming into that vessel constantly, right? They're flowing into that vessel. Well, I'm imaging this slice, and I'm hitting it with hundreds, thousands of RF pulses. Most of my tissues end up in some kind of steady state, and they just give me a signal that accords with some steady state. But the blood itself is pulsing in, depending on the heart rate. And there's new spins coming into that slice. They're unsaturated spins, and they typically will look very, very bright, except for when they slow down, because of the pulsation, they slow down and they're in the slice for longer, they'll saturate a little bit and look a little darker. So the underlying object may in fact have signal intensities that look very much like this. Now the question is, what happens as I acquire K-space? I shouldn't point to the image, but when I acquire K-space from top to bottom in an object that has this pulsating region of interest, right, or this pulsating tissue. So now this is my K-space acquisition, but whether or not this is bright or dark just depends on timing. Timing, of course, accords with where I am somewhere in K-space. And so the kinds of artifacts that you'll typically get if this is the acquired data for that pulsating thing is something like this. You'll see this sort of vessel of interest more or less in the middle, but then some artifact of the vessel appearing in other regions of the field of view. I don't know if I have... Okay, so then the question is maybe why, right? So I can take my, in this case, synthetic object, that's the static part, and that's the moving part, right? If I do just the Fourier transform of, the bottom part here, the moving part, then this is the kind of K-space data I'm going to get for this particular object that's turning on and off as I acquire K-space. When it's off, those K-space lines are off, right? And don't have any signal for those K lines that I'm acquiring. When it comes back on again, then I'm able to sample and measure those particular K points. So I get some oscillation through K-space that's related to how quickly I move through K-space, as well as the frequency of this pulsating thing, right? So the Fourier transform of this sort of band with this banding pattern imparted on it gives me something that looks like that. The Fourier transform of the top one is easy, right? It just looks like the normal object. So combining those things, those two things together, and I have the background object plus this sort of pulsating K-space on top. There's a more technical treatment of all of this in the lab book, of course. So the last example that was shown here was just that if the pulsation frequency changes, this is a lower frequency oscillation, meaning the heart rate is slowed down or something like that, that changes the banding pattern across K-space and consequently changes the appearance of the flow artifact in the underlying image itself. So in this case, when I had a lower frequency oscillation, I ended up with my object sort of even more closely spaced together. So what are our choices here? Well, there are different ways to sort of solve this problem. We're going to talk about cardiac gating already. You might combine cardiac gating with segmented imaging. Segmented imaging was that strategy for getting time-resolved images of dynamic processes. You can actually also do something to suppress the moving tissues and the flowing tissues. We didn't get a chance to talk about it yet, but there are strategies for suppressing signals that are like flowing into a slice. So if the aortic blood is flowing into the slice that you care about, I guess it would be flowing into the slice that you care about, you could saturate that blood before it arrives in the slice and make the blood dark. And that would help you get rid of these pulsation artifacts. And then you could think about swapping the phase and frequency encoding direction. So instead of acquiring K-space top down, you could acquire it left to right. And there's pluses and minuses to each of those, right? If you employ cardiac gating or segmented imaging, then you're going to increase your scan time. If you use some kind of signal suppression strategy, it's probably going to increase your TR because you have to have some additional pulses there to saturate the blood, for example. And if you just swap the phase and frequency encoding directions, it doesn't get rid of the artifact, it just changes the directionality of the artifact. So the example I showed you, the artifact was sort of spraying out top-bottom because that's the phase encoding direction. I could get the artifact to go left-right. That might be an acceptable thing clinically. It depends where the artifact is occurring. If it's occurring in a critical structure, you can just shift the artifact away and see what you need to see. Problem solved. But that's not always the case, or not always acceptable. Okay, we'll talk through as many of these as we can, maybe for another 5 minutes or so, and then I want to talk to you about the lab just for a few minutes. So metal artifacts are really just, they're in some sense related to severe off-resonance artifacts, right? Metal itself is going to have a strong effect on the underlying field, right? We want everything to be B0, but you have a titanium hip implant, and it has a significant impact on the local B0 field. Again, we know that through the application of a gradient that helps us map spatial positions to underlying frequencies. And we interpret the frequencies that we measure as telling us about what's happening in a particular spatial position. And so anytime we mix up the interpretation of what frequencies actually accord to in space, we'll end up with a problem. And so this is an example I think I showed you before, but you can have, say, a bunch of normal spins. They're all going to precess at the Larmor frequency. In the presence of a gradient, they'll have slightly different frequencies. If you have an off-resonance spin, this guy here, this could be a fat spin, but in this case, maybe it's a spin that's close to something metal. They might have the same Larmor frequency, and hence be interpreted as residing at a different spatial location. And so that spin there gives off a frequency that accords with it, not its actual spatial position, but some other spatial position. And that means there'll be perhaps a void. There's an area where there's no signal reporting from, or there's no tissue reporting from that position. And then if something moved away and overlaps with something else, then you can get higher signal intensities where the off-resonance spin has apparently shifted to. And that can happen to greater or lesser extents. If it's a small sort of coherent effect, as you would have a chemical shift in fat, you can have the overlapping of, say, fat with water, and you get some enhanced signal locally, and you get some gap where the fat is shifted away from. The effect, of course, can be a lot more severe. So this is actually a sagittal image through a knee it's almost hard to tell, but it's through someone's knee like this. So the tibia, the femur is up here and the tibia is up down here, and this is the knee implant. The knee implant itself causes so much off resonance that you end up with, a difficult to interpret image, but it still shows two fundamental things. There are large regions of signal pileup, really, really bright signals, because spins that are actually in other positions are reporting to all come from the same location. And then, of course, in the presence of where the device itself is, you won't generate an MR signal. But in more distant regions from the device, you also have overall signal loss, spins that represented at these bright regions that were taken away, so to speak, from other regions that appear dark. So it's a very challenging problem. There's some interesting work in this area, not work that we specifically do, but others, about trying to image near metal implanted devices, orthopedic implants in particular. Gradient nonlinearity you had as homework. Yeah, so I'm just going to skip that one, and we'll go talk about data. We'll talk about the next two, and then we'll talk about the final, or not the final, the lab for a little bit. This is just, in the category of possible MR-related artifacts. It's a good one to talk about. It doesn't occur all that often anymore because of the design of the systems. The basic idea is it's possible that your received signal could saturate the receiver itself. So the receiver is only expecting a signal with a certain maximum voltage, and something about how you set the gains on your receiver system, or something about the sample itself has led to an overrange where the voltage that's received is much higher than expected, so to speak. Obviously, the peak signal is usually going to be in the middle of K-space, and so if you have this data clipping artifact, it means that the received voltage was really, really high, say for the middle of K-space, and so it gets chopped off. You can't receive a voltage higher than 5 volts or something like this. So if you're chopping off basically the amplitude of the middle of K-space, that's going to have an effect on contrast and even overall image intensity. Now, usually this is handled by pre-scanning. When you go to run a scan on the scanner, it'll do a few little tests and checks to make sure that it's not going to overrange the receivers and everything is calibrated well, and we will adjust some gains. And that's the so-called pre-scan procedure. But if for some reason that process fails, and there's ways in which it can happen, despite there being pretty robust sequences, you could end up with something like this. So this is the expected or the sort of conventional expected K-space data, and then the image that corresponds with it. If this data for some reason was, 10-fold higher in intensity, but the receiver could only handle, a 5-fold or 2-fold higher intensity, then you get this sort of capping off of the maximum intensities in K-space. And you'll end up with these unusual-looking images that generally will have some kind of haze across them, and it will dramatically affect the contrast in particular, because a lot of your contrast information is in the middle of K-space. One of the sort of dead giveaways for this is usually outside of the object itself, you'll have some unusual sort of patterns and sort of intensity, brightness that you wouldn't expect normally. Okay, so then I'll talk about this one, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the lab, I think. We said before, way back when we were talking about the B0 field and the radio frequency field in some of the first lectures, we identified at least that the radio frequency fields that we use are at least maybe close to FM radio stations, but maybe more importantly, there's just a broad spectrum of electromagnetic radiation sort of everywhere. And so we have to design our MR scanner rooms to be shielded from to prevent local sources from interfering, right? So this is the MR scanner. Inside that scanner, you're going to place a coil that's extremely sensitive to picking up very small changes in magnetic flux as a part of that MR experiment. That same receiver coil could equally well pick up any electromagnetic energy that's reasonably on resonance or close to the resonance frequency for which the coil is tuned. So we have to keep stray RF energy out of the room. The way we do that is by putting together, by copper cladding the room such that it forms a Faraday cage, so that electromagnetic radiation isn't really getting into the room, so to speak, but isolates the room. There is, however, the need sometimes to put devices or run devices across a so-called penetration panel. If you're setting up an MR room for experimental purposes, You might have to get some source of therapy into the room. That could be an energy source, a laser source, something else. Or you may need to get imaging equipment. Sorry, not imaging equipment, but monitoring equipment in and out, or signals in and out of that MR room. And there is actually a way to do that through the so-called penetration panel. So I won't go into the details of that probably, but there's really sort of two options. You have what's called a waveguide. So the waveguide has a certain diameter and a certain length that will restrict certain electromagnetic frequencies and amplitudes of those frequencies. So you can openly pass things through this waveguide. Let's say you just have to provide gas or some kind of anesthetic into the room. You can do it through the waveguide. The other possibility is actually putting in things across a BNC or RS-232 or something like that, which you can do, but you need to have an RF filter on it as well. So you have to be really careful about signals and things that you're bringing in and out of the MR room. If you aren't careful about these things, then you'll end up with some kind of, these are the kinds of artifacts that you can end up with. And they're not always quite as discrete as this. This is a very sort of narrow RF frequency artifact. Sometimes they're relatively broad, but it stands out as sort of being this very sort of strip through the image that's causing a discrete problem for the images. In fact, when the Reagan Hospital first opened up, one of the scanners there had an RF leak for probably a year or more. And it became this big, it was really a mess because everyone was blaming everyone, of course, right? The scanner manufacturers blaming construction, construction's blaming the guy that did this, and that guy's blaming this guy. And it took literally forever, or it seemed like forever to get it resolved. And so for a solid year, maybe even longer, almost all the clinical images coming out of Reagan on the 1.5T had these terrible RF artifacts. It's just unbelievable. But anyway, this is life sometimes. Okay, so I think that wraps up what I. Oh no, we can do this. This is fun. Okay, so we went through a bunch of artifacts there, right? So the left-hand side is sort of a well-formed object, the actual object, and this is an artifacted version of that same object on the right-hand side. So let's just see if we can quickly. I hope it's not in your slides. If it is, just look at it. But what artifacts can you guys identify in this image that's on the right-hand side? Just call it out. Ooh, ringing artifact. Okay, you guys are enthusiastic. Yeah, so definitely Gibbs ringing artifact. That was the first one I saw. What else?
Noise.
Noise. Thank you. Noise is an artifact, right? Don't forget it. Noise is an artifact. What else? Chemical shifts. Yeah. So there's a bright ring that's formed here and it's shifted to the right. There's a null space that's sort of over here. It looks like it's overlapping over there. What else? Yeah, gradient nonlinearity or distortion. And this highlights something. If you go look at clinical images or images coming off of your clinical scanners, you can tell, first off, you can tell because you have a reference standard that the geometry is distorted, right? If you didn't have, and so that's one way we would say, oh yeah, there's definitely a geometric distortion in gradient nonlinearity. If you didn't have this underlying reference image, you might not be able to identify that the object itself is deformed, right? Or has some lack of fidelity in its geometric accuracy. But if you look at real images coming off the scanner, you'll actually be able to see these completely null areas, right? And that's because they had to warp the image to be consistent with what they understand about their own gradient nonlinearity. And so they have to squish, squash, push the image around. You'll end up with areas that are completely zero, right? Don't make an SNR measurement where you calculate the variance here. Right? Okay, that's a good MR joke. But that's an example of why, like, calculating signal to noise the way we sort of described isn't always an acceptable standard. There are reasons why it could be a terrible thing to do, right? But you'll notice that gradient nonlinearity. You'll notice it in images. If you window level it heavily, you'll see these areas of zero. Anything else? Oh yeah, there's at least one more.
Corn.
What's that?
The corn. Constant thickness.
Yeah. What do you notice?
Wider on the upper left and darker.
Yep. So brighter in the upper left, darker in the lower right. So if I had a 4-channel receiver system, right, there's something wrong with that channel. There's possibly something wrong with that channel. So you're not getting good sort of overall signal from that region. Okay, I think that's everything. Anything else? Anyone see another one? I don't think so. Is the answer there? Yeah, okay. So I think we got through all those. Okay, good. So I won't get into gradient echoes and fat. We'll try to pick that up at a different time. I'll make a couple comments about the lab tonight. So you should now have in your inbox the screening form. Please fill it out. There's about a 2-page, 1.5-page sort of write-up about the lab. If there's any changes to it, I'll let you know, but it should be stable at this point. you're mostly just going to have to come to the lab, break into your groups. We'll do a little bit of a demo so you can sort of see the scanner and sort of understand the scan environment a little bit. And then you'll actually work on the scanners with each of the TAs. There's 3 of you on each scanner, and there'll be a TA on each scanner, and I'll be there kind of floating back and forth. In the goal tonight, we set up something that I think is pretty cool. You're going to be given a phantom that's a 16 by 16 grid. So you think of every grid spot as almost like a pixel, right? And you can fill those pixels with water, okay? What you're going to do is you're going to have some defined patterns, some designated patterns, and you're going to image those objects, image this phantom with, say, a cross pattern of water, and then you're also going to image it with bands of water, sort of a stripe of water, a stripe of water, a stripe of water, a stripe of water. And the pulse sequence that we set up is a gradient echo sequence that will reconstruct the magnitude images, but also magnitude k-space. Okay, so you're going to get the sort of immediate feedback of what image did I get and what k-space did I get. And the lab tonight is basically about changing the imaging conditions and making observations, predicting what you're going to see in k-space, and then comparing what you predict to what you actually see. Okay, so you'll get this, hopefully get this kind of real-time feedback as to when you change an imaging parameter, that's how my image changed, that's how my k-space changed. But the key for it, and the key to writing up your lab, is your predictions. Right? You're going to just in lab, you're going to predict, oh, if this happens, if we make that change, I think this is what's going to happen. I don't care if you're right or wrong, right? We're just scientists, right? We're just making hypotheses. So you need a good guess, and then you're going to get an answer, and it's either going to be a good fit or not, but you still have to explain it, right? That your observation is consistent with what you guessed, and this is why, or no, you thought this was going to happen, and you saw this happen, and now you're going to kind of reconcile the two. The third, so you'll have 2 different patterns that you're supposed to use and kind of work through different sort of examples that we've provided. And then you'll also have the chance to make your own phantom. So you'll take that same phantom and fill it up with a pattern of water that you want to fill it up with. But the idea is that you do something interesting, right? That you don't just fill it with water, right? So that's probably the one thing I would think of ahead of time. If you're going to fill this grid, what would be an interesting pattern to potentially fill it with? And then what things would you predict? And then you can look at your observations and so on. But it'll give you a chance to work on the scan. It's really fun. Cool? Okay, if you have questions, let me know. I'll hang out for a bit.